Hello, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Trujillo, Professor of Law at University of Houston Law Center and the founding director of our new initiative, Global Law and Policy for the Americas. Welcome to our sixth webinar and final webinar on constitutionalism, trade, social justice, and sustainability in the Americas, lessons from the 2020 global pandemic. This is the last webinar of a six-part series, which we have thoroughly enjoyed, and we thank all of you for your participation, your wonderful questions, and all of the speakers who have participated in this series. This webinar series has gathered more than 150 participants from around the world, from Latin America, Europe, Africa, the United States, and Asia. Today's webinar is on COVID and trends on constitutionalism, a comparative approach, with Professor Tom Ginsberg from the University of Chicago as the keynote speaker, Professor James Gathie from Loyola University Chicago School of Law as our moderator and discussant, and our Sabrina Ragone as our principal discussant. GLAPA is an initiative that provides a platform to examine issues of international and global law from the perspective of its intersection with local policy and governance. This webinar series reflects this purpose, allowing us to learn from this important historical moment of COVID-19 so that we may formulate better legal frameworks in various areas where the pandemic has impacted society. Webinars have included topics around the 2020 global pandemic on issues of social justice, international law, health and climate change, human rights, and trade. Expert speakers have highlighted lessons that the COVID-19 is teaching us in these various fields, such as the need for more equitable access to healthcare and vaccines, the best ways in which to enhance this access, including the role of trade and legal frameworks, both internationally and domestically, the need for reconfiguring economic strategies to provide wider access, and that better comports with climate and technological needs for the future. And also reimagining the role of our domestic and international institutions to better deal with global emergencies, as well as regional strategies for combating the pandemic, all with the goal of learning from this pandemic so we may better manage global emergencies moving forwards. Summaries and recordings of all the webinars can be found on the GLAPA website. Before introducing our moderator today, though, I do want to thank my co-organizer, who is also our discussant for today's webinar, Sabrina Ragone, for her collaboration and hard work, making this webinar series a success, to the University of Bologna Center for Latin American Studies, and the ASO Latin America Group and their co-chairs for their co-sponsorship. I also want to thank the EU Commission Jean Monnet Module Crises and the EU Erasmus Program for their co-sponsorship for this particular webinar. I'm really excited to welcome our moderator today, Professor James T. Gathie, who is an expert as well on constitutional law issues, in particular as it pertains to Africa. Professor Gathie is the Whit Tang Lee Chair in International Law and Professor of Law at Loyola University Chicago School of Law since July 2012. He's a graduate of the University of Nairobi, Kenya, and Harvard Law School. He sits on the board of editors of the American Journal of International Law, the Journal of African Law, and the Journal of International Trade and Policy, among others. He's the co-editor-in-chief of the African Journal of International Economic Law. He was the Grotius Lecturer at the ASO Society of the American Society of International Law virtual annual meeting for 2020. His research and teaching interests span the range of public international law, international trade law, third world approaches to international law, comparative constitutional law, and human rights. He has served as independent expert of working groups on extractive industries, environment, and human rights violations in Africa, formed by the African Commission on Human and People Rights between 2012 and 2020. He's authored over 90 articles and book chapters, written several books, including his most recent edited book by Oxford University Press, The Performance of Africa's International Courts, Using Litigation for Political, Legal, and Social Change. He's consulted on several international organizations, and he's been an elected member of the International Academy of International Law. With no further ado, I would like to pass the podium to Professor James Gathie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Trujillo, and many thanks again for inviting me to moderate this session. My role is pretty brief. I'll introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Tom Ginsberg, and our discussant, Professor Sabrina Ragone. And then after both have gone, Tom for 20 minutes and several minutes for Professor Ragone, the audience can put their questions in the Q&A box at the end. We hope to be going on until about 11 a.m. Central Time, Standard Time. So Professor Tom Ginsberg is the Leo Spitz Professor of International Law at the University of Chicago, where he also holds an appointment in the Political Science Department. He currently co-directs the Comparative Constitutions project, an NSF funded dataset cataloging the world's constitution since 1789 that runs the award-winning Constitute website. His latest book is How to Save a Constitutional Democracy with Aziz Haq, and his other books include Judicial Reputation, a Comparative Theory, 2015, written with Garupa, The Endurance of National Constitutions, which also won the Best Book Award Prize from the Comparative Democratization section of the American Political Science Association. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Social Sciences. He is currently a senior advisor on constitution building to International IDEA, among many things, including serving as an editor on the American Journal of International Law. Sabrina Ragon is a professor of comparative law at the University of Bologna and a senior research affiliate of the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law, Heidelberg. Previously, she was a research fellow at the Center for Political and Constitutional Studies in Madrid and the Autonomous University of Barcelona. She has held research and visiting professor positions in several academic institutions in Europe, as well as in Latin America and the United States. Her extensive publications address comparative law, methodology, and substance in Italian, English, German, Portuguese, and French. She has authored 5 books, 5 edited books, and more than 90 journal articles and book chapters. Her latest book is Parliamentary Systems and Economic Crisis, Changes to Constitutional Arrangements in Italy and Spain. So we are in for a treat. Tom, your 20 minutes starts now.
Thank you so much, Professor Gatti, and thank you, Professor Trujillo and Professor Ragone for organizing, looks like a terrific and very interesting series here. My talk is going to be from a paper that I have co-authored with Professor Mila Versteeg at the University of Virginia that's forthcoming in the International Journal of Constitutional Law. And it's really about the role of constitutions and courts in responding to COVID. So, and I assume that the PowerPoint is working. So what we did is in the early months of the COVID crisis, we started cataloging the governmental responses. And we did that for about a half a year, a little more than half a year. And we were responding to a major issue in public law theory. It's an issue that goes back actually to the Romans, the problem of emergency rule. We set up systems of government and constitutions, they work, but then every once in a while there is some crisis for which the ordinary institutions don't work or are not sufficient. And if that crisis is serious enough to threaten the polity, well, we might need to suspend the ordinary rules of government. That's the basic idea. The Romans developed this idea of the dictatorship, which of course we think of as a pejorative sense, but for them was actually just a regular institution of government. And what it meant is that when there was a crisis, like the Germans were coming to invade or something, what they do is they would suspend the Constitution and give all power to the dictator, but for a limited period. And the dictator was usually a retired general or something. So this person could do whatever it took to save the country. And the only rule was that they could have power for no more than 6 months. So it's a very interesting institution. Of course, it's had some influence on constitution making today. It had, of course, these 3 principles. You could only do it when necessary. Temporal limits, as I said. And critically, the body that was declaring the emergency was different than the body that was exercising power. And that's sort of an obvious kind of moral hazard issue. If you let, let's say a national executive say, now it's an emergency and I get all power, well, that's going to create an incentive to do so. So these legal principles, like many things from the Romans, have survived for many, many years and we continue to wrestle with. The theoretical debate is whether law can actually constrain executive power in these states of exception. And there's debate in Western political theory about this. Machiavelli says, yes, these kind of rules are necessary. You should have emergency rules. You should recognize they're going to be necessary. But then there are folks like John Locke who said, at the end of the day, there's this thing, this kind of sovereign power, which just actually can't be controlled, and law runs out. And in modern debates, this has continued to be an issue, and actually, is one that was recently invoked after the war on terror began by my colleague Eric Posner. And so, in some sense, this whole paper is kind of a test or a challenge to my colleague at the University of Chicago, Eric Posner, and his work with Adrian Vermeule. So, in this book on the right, they say basically, in emergencies, all power has to go to the executive. Courts can't do anything. Legislatures can't do anything. And not only that, modern government is generally like this. Like, it's not even a condition of emergencies. Executives control government because they have more information, they can act quickly, and there's very little any of us can do about it except to accept it. So that's their position. And I think probably if you were to have a conversation, Professor Posner might have backed off that position. But Professor Vermeule has gone in a very different direction with those who follow his work. So law, what could law do? Well, you could imagine things like these Roman restrictions, require measures that were strictly necessary, or only those measures which were strictly necessary, temporarily limited, making sure that when emergency measures are implemented, that there's no discrimination. They're not targeting a particular minority or something like that. And then, of course, a critical principle in modern government: can judges engage in oversight? And I think these are feasible and valid ideas. But we always come back in these debates, these theoretical debates, to Carl Schmitt, the man in the middle, the great theorist of Nazi law. And Schmitt's view was that, like Locke, there's a point at which law just runs out, that someone gets to decide what is the exceptional state, and that person is the true sovereign. And that's really Adrian Vermeule's kind of Schmittian, I would say. Now, the man on the right is Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary. And Orban, in the COVID pandemic, basically got his legislature to pass an emergency decree which gave him all power. It's a very Schmittian move. Orban can now rule by decree as long as the COVID crisis continues. He is the only one who can decide when the crisis ends. And he's completely allowed to act notwithstanding ordinary law. So all power has flowed to this one man in this rather, I don't want to say a major country, but it's right in the middle of Europe, and it's a member of the European Union. It's no longer, in that sense, a democracy. It's precisely because of these legal theories that it's embodied. So that raises the point: are we generally in this state? Is that what's going on? So when we look at post-war constitutions, we do see many, I guess I'd say, Machiavellian kind of institutions or Roman institutions, like attempts to constitutionalize the emergency provision, and to set aside, have conditions under which law could be suspended. But generally speaking, they would be, there are requirements on them. And, the figure on the right is sort of the trend in constitutions. You can see the percentage of constitutions that actually talk about emergencies has really gone up. It's, nearly all of them today. United States is an exception. We don't have really emergency rules. Generally speaking, they focus on classical kinds of emergencies: wars, internal security. One of the points of our paper is that probably they need to be modified to deal with things like pandemics or financial crises, which are the modal kind of emergencies we face today, and actually have a very different quality in terms of thinking about what government needs to do to respond. I would argue, and probably won't have time to fully develop the point, but perhaps in Q&A, that these kind of emergencies are precisely the ones where executive power isn't very helpful, where you actually benefit from having other institutions involved, because information on the nature of the crisis and the nature of the needed response is widely distributed. And also, pandemics tend to be a little more slow moving, honestly. And if you think about emergencies like climate change, they're extremely slow moving. So the idea that emergency power should be executive power seems precisely wrong to me with these kind of emergencies. In any case, you can see post-war constitutions tend to adopt these legal principles. There's got to be, you can declare a state of emergency, it must be done by law, temporally limited. Certain rights cannot be ever limited. So even in emergency, you can't, for example, torture people. And, you know, courts are often involved in scrutinizing. So that's what constitutions say. Skip that slide. All right, so we get COVID. What do we see? If you followed Vermeulen and Posner, you'd say, well, we should see massive power grabs by the executive, and the executive should lead the response. And it is true, interestingly, that we have several examples in the crisis where the existing legal framework actually was not sufficient to deal with the problem. And so in this sense, like, it sort of leads me to think, well, Schmidt and maybe Vermeulen are right that there are points when the law runs out. And we should not, in my view, be strict legal formalists in this regard and say that the requirement of legality is such that it should keep a government from taking truly necessary measures. And these are just three examples. You know, in Ghana's initial response, you know, they didn't actually have legal mandate to impose lockdowns, and they did it anyway. And then they got the legislature to pass such a law. Taiwan is very interesting. It's the jurisdiction, 23 million people, with absolutely the best coronavirus response of anywhere. Only 7 deaths in a country of 23 million people. Now, those of you in the United States, like if you translate that to the United States, that would be about 100, 150 deaths in the whole country. So it's an amazingly good response. Well over 500,000 because of our bungled response. So they did something right, but interestingly, the legal basis of it was not very sound. That is, what happened is they had some immediate responses, and then they got retroactive blessing of these things through legislation later. So, and Italy did the same. There was a challenge to some of the Italian response up around Bergamo, I guess it was, you know, where there was a decree, that executive decree rather than a law that was used to invoke the emergency. So in any case, sometimes law runs out. I think that's okay. The question is when there is our principles of legality, our principles of the rule of law followed in trying to go back and fix the thing, or is it used simply to, you know, grab power? So when we look around the world, we actually see, contra Vermeulen and Posner, lots of examples where courts and legislatures were involved in the COVID response, and it helped. So one example would be Israel. Israel had a initial situation where they wanted to use cell phones to track contacts of people who had gotten the disease. And in Israel, they do have a rule that allows the police or government officials to track people's cell phones, but the law only allows that for situations where someone's a suspected terrorist. So extending that to the whole population would have been a violation of law. And this was being debated actually at a time, for those of you who follow it, you know, Israel's been trying to form a government for well over a year to keep having elections. And this was a period when there was no government in place. And so you really had this situation where it seemed to be like Parliament wasn't meeting and such. Like there really could have been an executive grab here. And the court said, no, you cannot do that. You need to go get legislative authorization, and then you must pass legislation to allow this to happen, notwithstanding the sense of urgency. Kosovo similarly set aside its initial lockdown. I'm not going to go through every bullet point in my slide, but I'll just give you some highlights. Malawi, very interesting story. The president of Malawi had basically cheated on an election the year before, and there was plans to have a new election and to redo that. And he said, well, you know, we got coronavirus, can't possibly have an election. And by the way, we're going to have a lockdown. And actually, the Malawi Supreme Court said, not only must you have this election, but we're not even going to allow you to have a lockdown, because that would have negative effects vis-a-vis political organizing. And at the end of the day, the election did go forward. That president lost. And it was, it's sort of a near miss. Like if the court had not stood up, Malawi would not have been a democracy today. So it's a kind of incredible story where the courts blocked a power grab using coronavirus as an excuse. In other cases, courts have actually demanded action when the governments. This is a very interesting point about the coronavirus pandemic. You have people like Bolsonaro in Brazil, where his attitude is, hey, it was sort of like Donald Trump for Americans. Right? No big deal. Yeah, herd immunity. Let's not get upset about this. It's an interesting example of what David Posen and Kim Shepley call executive underreach, not grabbing power, but just doing too little. And in that country, courts actually ordered lower governments and the national government to take certain steps, to stop putting out propaganda and disinformation, and in some cases to impose restrictions on people that the governments didn't want it. So that's pretty interesting. So we see both courts preventing government action, but also demanding it, limiting the use of coercive force, and measuring whether the lockdowns are proportional, which is kind of classic the courts do. Legislatures too, I mentioned Taiwan's act before. The UK passed a Coronavirus Act, which I think was really a model of legislation. They sort of went through the entire gamut of British law, which would be affected by this pandemic, and legalized all the measures which would have to change in order to respond. But they also said that all of the provisions of this act would expire once the crisis is back, so that you avoid the problem of the ratchet effect where we adopt something for one emergency and then it just stays on forever. American scholars of emergency government note that in our country, we don't have constitutional emergencies, but we have statutes that are designed to address emergencies. And many of those, they're passed for one particular crisis and then they just last forever. Maybe a salient example would be the authorization for the use of military force after September 11th, still in place today and being used to justify all kinds of, drone killings of Americans, things like this all over the world, when it was only designed to respond, or one would think to design, an immediate crisis. So the fact that the legislation would disappear was really a good thing, self-destructive. Now there is, of course, it's not all a happy story. We do have some autocrats who have abused the COVID crisis for their own benefit. So I've already mentioned Viktor Orban. The man in the upper left, of course, is President Erdogan of Turkey, who actually was, because the prisons are often obviously a big site of COVID spread, said, okay, we're going to have a general release of people from the prisons, if they're not dangerous, but anyone who's in prison for having criticized me, they're staying. So that kind of selective move is something that autocrats can do. Government in Hong Kong has changed radically during this period. It's basically over as a distinct system within China. And that's a whole nother story as to why that's happened. But the point being that there's some sense that the COVID crisis allowed the Chinese government to go ahead with this in ways because it was a little below the radar. And then there's Hun Sen. There's many countries have passed disinformation laws about COVID, but in an authoritarian context, those could be used, of course, to prosecute, the enemies of the ruler. And Hun Sen in Cambodia, certainly one of the world's longest-serving dictators at this point, did that. And so you can see that there is potential for abuse, and that does happen. So then, I guess the question is, what do we see and where do we see it? And so what this figure shows is it kind of identifies countries for risks of backslide, democratic backslide. And this is drawn from other literature. But we know what it is that causes backward movement in democracies. Polarization, countries with histories of political instability. If there's an economic recession, which of course many countries have experienced under COVID, poverty, resource curse type of issues. Countries which experience these things are always at risk of democratic backslide. And you can see, those of you in the United States, we do have at least one of these, right? We have polarization. And I think it's safe to say our backsliding in our country has accelerated since the financial crisis of 2007 and 8. All that being said, is you can see which countries are most at risk for backsliding here. And some of the ones at risk are exactly where we've seen it. So Cambodia, Hungary is sort of yellow in this one. And, you know, I didn't run a regression model about this or anything like that, but it certainly, you know, would be interesting to sort of try to figure out where we've seen systematically, where we've seen erosion occur and where it has not. Okay, am I out of time? I can't tell.
You are right on time. Are you done, or you have a couple of more
I'm
things?
perfectly happy to stop and just say I look forward to Professor Ragone's questions and as well as those from the floor.
Great, thank you. That was really great. Professor Ragone?
Thanks a lot for the presentation, for the introduction, and also for sharing this amazing piece of research with us. I'm truly honored to be the discussant of today's webinar. I will divide my comments into 3 parts. I will have 3 for everything. So 3 introductory remarks, 3 observations concerning the methodology and the results of the study with respect to the role of domestic executives. And I will conclude with some ideas about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on constitutions and constitutionalism that hopefully will foster further debate starting from this topic. Introductory remarks. Let me say that I think that the piece provides a fantastic amount of data and information for scholars all over the world, fostering possible future studies that follow this same arrangement. The data, if I'm not mistaken, are updated to July 2020, and probably many things have happened since then. And I think that we can find relevant insights also in more recent events with respect to the trends that Tom and his co-author underlined in the paper. I also appreciate a lot research that challenges the widespread understanding of a phenomenon, like this idea of the bound, unbound executive, which is the mainstream idea of how the separation of powers is being affected currently. But then if we actually look into it, probably that's not so true, or it's not true everywhere. And I also think that the contextualization within the different models or kinds or types of emergencies is very useful in the paper. It's also very useful to understand the differences between the financial crisis and this crisis. And maybe we can go back into this into this point in the Q&A. Now, with respect to some substantive aspects, as I mentioned, I would like to focus on 3 issues. The first one is the role of deliberation and cooperation between different institutions in the management of the response to the pandemic emergency, which is underlined in the text. I agree that this is a trend which has become stronger in several countries. I refer in particular to decentralized countries, federal and regional countries, because progressively there has been a more clear involvement of subnational authorities. Nevertheless, I wonder to what extent this responds more to a strategic target than necessarily to the idea of improving the legal solution provided to the population. I mean, as you mentioned in the paper, the role of the states, regions, and local entities is paramount. But from the perspective of the state, involving these territorial entities in the decision-making process is beneficial to ensure a better implementation of the decisions, even when these decisions are basically adopted by the center. They're involved, but in many cases, their actual possibility to influence the decision is very tiny. Plus, with respect to this, at some point, there is a reference to the fact that a concentrated response in a case like a pandemic emergency is less critical than for a national security crisis. And I think that in this respect, the issue of differentiation among different territories has become crucial. It has been crucial since the start of this crisis, because let's say, as I will mention at the end, proportionality in terms of the time, for example, for the limitation of certain rights also shall be applied to proportionality with respect to the actual situation of the different territories. And that's why many territories have claimed that they wish to have a different treatment or different conditions with respect to the rest of the countries. In the center peripheries relationship, we can also see different phases. Or if we think about the beginning, the first months, it's been already more than 1 year, some territories wish to have at that point more powers to choose different policies, either stricter or less strict. We can see both comparatively than the ones adopted by the government. I think there has been a shift over time, because now many regions do prefer a national solution in order to attribute the political accountability to the state instead of themselves. In particular, when we talk about very unpopular measures like curfews or the duty to close down shops, restaurants, etc. Second aspect of this second part, the role of legislators. I also think that these statistics are very useful, also because the mainstream idea is that the parliaments are not able to face emergencies because, of course, they're slower, because there is also the opposition there, and it's not the same thing as adopting a decision in the Council of Ministries. I also have in mind, in addition to the two major examples or categories mentioned in the paper, so constitutional clauses on emergencies versus legislative interventions, which is very useful to situate all the cases. I also have in mind systems which, let's say, somehow do not respond exactly to any of these criteria, where there has been basically a misuse of constitutionally regulated measures. For example, you mentioned at some point the law decrees, which have been used in Italy, but also in Spain, in this emergency, similarly to the financial crisis. But these measures are completely constitutional. The point is that they have been used to regulate everything, plus, depending on the majority in parliament, they are basically ratified. So there is no actual intervention, let's say substantive intervention by the parliaments. And so I wonder to what extent this is genuine legislative participation, or whether we need to include probably on a case-by-case analysis, also a qualitative analysis to see to what extent the parliaments have participated. While the case that you mentioned today in the presentation, so the prime minister's decrees in Italy, yes, I think they would fit in this idea of the law that runs out, because it's something that was decided by the prime minister. We had to wait for these decrees, which are different from the law decrees approved also by the parliament. About the role of domestic parliaments, if we think about the EU, so of course, this is the European perspective on this. There is also another thing to take into account, which is that it is the executive that interacts with the EU institutions. It's not the parliament. So the negotiations about the recovery plan, the vaccination plan, in all of these aspects, the role of the executive has been and is still more relevant than the parliament. Although, as it is mentioned in the text, there is an ongoing involvement of parliaments, which is a significant advancement, especially I would say over the past months. There are new special committees being instituted to assess the response by the executive to the emergency. Very briefly on the role of courts. We would have expected probably more differential courts than the ones that you have described in the text and in the presentation. But I think that we need to wait and see what has happened. I mean, what's going to happen in the next months and what has happened also over the past months, because the cases that were decided by July 2020 were either very urgent cases or were special procedures, while meanwhile, new ordinary cases have been brought before courts. Many of them have not been decided yet, in particular with respect to limitations to rights. So I think we still have to wait to see a few years to see what the actual attitude of courts has been, and there will be many cases on vaccinations, for sure, about interterritorial differentiation, categories, the way in which the priorities have been set by the government. There will be many cases for sure. Concluding on this point, I agree that crises and emergencies expose or strengthen trends which are already there. You have mentioned very clearly the case of Hungary, but also other countries which have been, for example, very much affected during the financial crisis, have gone through the same path in these emergencies. So something that was already there, it has been simply strengthened by this emergency. Finally, the third part, so the impact on constitutionalism. Of course, I can only mention a few effects, hoping that the debate will then focus on some of them. So first effect, the emergence of worsening of inequalities in the society. If we have a look at the statistics concerning the most affected groups, this become clear, but in terms of constitutionalism, constitutional design, this needs to be considered. This is something that we have to take into account, I think. Of course, these are more general ideas about the topic of today's webinar. The second effect has been the limitation of rights and freedoms, spanning traditional rights to social rights and also to what we call economic rights. I mean, from free movement to religious freedom, right to health, education, the right to work, the freedom of enterprise. And as I mentioned before, in this respect, proportionality has become essential in terms of time, but also in terms of differentiation according to the factual situation, which is not so easy often. Third and last point here, so the impact on the form of government or the political system. We have witnessed a clear personalization of politics. There has been a very clear, like every solution has been connected to a politician, even when it was a collective or collegial decision. There has been in many countries a sidelining of the opposition, which in my opinion has not been compensated by the legislative intervention. Plus, we have seen a new relationship, a connection between expertise and politics. This is something that we have addressed also in other webinars in this series. So we have experts groups now everywhere, always at the national level, the role of health institutes, or for example, the Robert Koch Institute in Germany. And in times of skepticism with respect to science, this is something that, I mean, is worth underlining. I think this has been more at the beginning than now, especially after all the debates and the doubts about the vaccines. Just to end on a positive note, from a constructive perspective, which is something that we have tried to favor in this series, I think we should not miss the opportunity to take this crisis seriously. The etymology of crisis, the Greek etymology means like decision of choice. This is connected to this idea. So this emergency has opened new debates on the executive power, new debates on the role of parliaments, and new debates on the coordination between the state and decentralized entities. And it has reopened a debate on the principle of solidarity at the domestic and the supranational levels. And this is something that I value particularly. Thanks a lot again. I stop here.
Great. I think the arrangement, Tom, is that you have a couple of minutes to respond. We already have 3 queries in the Q&A function, and we'll get to those in a minute. So Tom, do you want to?
Great. I'll just respond to a couple of points. Yeah, obviously we had limited data. We decided to stop doing this. I mean, I've got other agenda. So, but I do think it's a critical period, because this is exactly when you would expect the greatest sense of emergency for the early months. And so if Posner and Vermeule were really right, then we would have really seen a massive executive power grab. So one of the things I didn't mention in my presentation, but which Professor Ragone brought up, is the role of subnational governments. And it's been obviously extremely important. And we think that's theoretically sound, because of course that's, you know, where the information, not all areas of the country are equally situated. And I think in many countries we see that, that they have played a role, sometimes pushing back, sometimes pushing the national government further. Certainly in a place like the United States, a federal country, where you have some states moving ahead, some behind. Even within the Republican Party, you know, Brian Kemp ignored Donald Trump by opening up Georgia before Trump, you know, his sovereign role declared that he could do that. And then, of course, other states have had restrictions. So I think that's right. It's very important. You know, one point which I wanted to raise is that we've seen courts kind of, and maybe I'm just being too America focused here, but in the United States, the courts have done a lot of work that would be I guess, proportionality, looking at particular measures and saying this one is necessary, this one's not. In our national context, one of the very interesting developments is this particular Supreme Court really using the COVID crisis to make grand statements about religion, because it's one of the agenda of certain members of the court. And they're just, instead of being minimalist and careful and being about proportionality, they use sort of principles of proportionality to make these sweeping statements about, religion is under threat here. And in some cases, they're appropriate. Catholic Church v. Cuomo is a famous case where, there was an excessive lockdown. So that's an interesting development too. And I guess it kind of goes to your point that there's like a politics of this crisis response where institutions are sort of jockeying and in negotiation with each other. It's just interesting to observe. One point, I want to make two final points. One is that we don't have a view as to what the right response was. I think that really will take place. How much lockdown, we really don't know. And of course, it's hard because the virus itself is mutating in, interesting and complex directions. So it's just difficult to ever know. I mean, we may never know exactly like what proper, the most technically correct response was. But I think we can say that places which have had these kind of genuine dialogues among institutions, at least the democratic side is healthy, whether or not the population ended up being healthy or not. It's the dialogues have tended to be in moving things towards a more moderate position, I'd say. And finally, I think maybe that's also, oh, and the other just caveat, I mean, we acknowledge that we don't really go into like, was the legislature genuinely substantively involved when it goes and blesses emergency responses as statute requires it to do, or when it approves an extension of a lockdown? It's hard to know, just hard to measure. So I acknowledge that point that you raised. I think it's a valid one. So with that, I'll stop and open it up more broadly, or turn back to James.
Great. So I just have one kind of a query, which is sort of a conceptual query. So you counterpose yourself to Posner and Bermuel and sort of characterize that in sort of Schmittian terms. In the African context, the way in which emergencies have generally been conceptualized, especially with coup d'etat, as you know, and constitutional overthrow, those emergencies have been characterized in Kelsenian terms rather than in Schmittian terms. And so I sort of, when I've looked at some of the discussions, especially around whether elections should or should not be held, and all the very pressing questions about democratization, the discussion has been more in those Kelsenian, have really been influenced by sort of that Kelsenian framework. Uganda is a really good example. And while there's been no overthrow of the constitutional order as such, I sort of wondered where that path dependency of that notion of dealing with emergencies fits within your framework, or whether this is something that's entirely different because you're dealing with for example, suspensions of certain rights or restrictions that don't go to the whole question of constitutional overthrow.
Yeah, I think we're interested in that. I mean, notwithstanding the Schmittian discussion I was bringing, I don't think that's absolutely essential. It's just kind of a framing device for us to go look at the data. And then the data, I think, does address these issues about like election suspensions, which we talk about a little, but others have really done a lot of work. It's interesting. Again, we see sort of some places which went ahead with elections, insisted on going ahead, other places where they said, no, we couldn't possibly have elections. Again, it's hard to know what the correct answer was. But there is certainly manipulation that's going on. And the Malawi example I think showed. And we see a number of examples where, parties were jockeying for position within the constitutional order. And I guess that's what we would expect. So I guess I would say, don't put too much weight on the Schmittian point. That's just one way in which the literature is focused on how emergencies could be abused. But there are, of course, other ways, infra-constitutional. And I think actually any discussion of the United States would have to include that because we don't have constitutionalized emergencies.
Great. So we have a question from the first question here from Carlos Capi. Professor Ginsberg, great presentation. Could you comment on the role of ACMEs or lack thereof to internet access infrastructure in some of these countries and the ability to be governed? You mentioned agency in Israel, for example, which had a superb IC infrastructure, but in some places, how did the system converse with one another? How did the legislature, judicial, executive in these different spaces communicate in places that had lagging ICT? Did all or almost all these countries end up relying on the internet to continue to function? Did any country revert back in some sense to other ways of enacting policy? The US, for example, Senate refused to go fully online. Put simply, during COVID, did ICT internet make things easier for dictators or harder and their legislative efforts? What about for democracies? And that reminds me of Ethiopia as sort of one of those countries, as you know, that's been going through lots of issues along those lines.
Great, so a lot of questions there. I guess I'll focus first on the ICT thing. And it's not, I haven't done as much research on here. There is actually an Israeli guy, Itai Bar Simon Tov, I can maybe write his name in the chat, who is immediately, as soon as COVID started gathering data on legislative response, how legislatures responded. Did they stay open? Did they move online? Did they just suspend operations? Of course, there's this long tradition that legislatures should operate in person. But of course, technically, there's no reason for that, right? Just as we are having this seminar on Zoom, it's working perfectly fine. Academia adjusted to the pandemic. Legislatures could obviously do that. And yet we did see in many countries massive resistance to that, as with the US Senate. And again, I think this is sort of in the realm of partisan manipulation, you know, trying to accuse the other side of something or another. So it is prone for abuse. Now, there's a whole catalog, all this data on which legislatures closed down, what they did, how quickly they went to emergency measures, and his research addresses that. Obviously, ICT is a critical component of that, but no, it's not, yeah, it is. I mean, so, you know, you might expect that that's easier to do in a fully developed country than a poorer one. But I don't know the correlations. I just didn't look to see whether the ICT correlates with the legislative, you know, move to being online. Let's see, and then the next question was about, nor dictatorships or democracies. Obviously, in a dictatorship, you know, the legislature going online or meeting in person is just not that important, right? It depends really on what the function of the legislature is in that particular authoritarian regime. And the category is so big that it is hard to make generalizations. You know, in a country which is like a backsliding democracy, the legislature may be still have some room for the opposition, and that's where you might see moves to shut down the entire legislature. And Professor Gatti, you may know, you know, what happened in Ethiopia in this regard, or Uganda. Whereas a country which is a full-on dictatorship is in China, move it online. You know, we keep the wheels of government going, no fear. So that's my response.
Great. There's another question from Michael Singletary. Has COVID had an effect on diplomatic relations between various countries, allies, and adversaries? And there's another question on the queue, but Sabrina, you can feel free to add on to what Professor Ginsberg has said or is going to say in response to the next question.
So I should answer, I guess. So, let me just say, I don't have much view, and I'm happy to hear what the other panelists think. But I think the vaccine is playing a major role in diplomacy. You see countries reaching out and generously sharing the vaccine. And now we have countries like India, which are granting it to, to various countries. And I think the vaccine response itself kind of interacts with this democracy stuff. It's obviously a diplomatic point, but Thailand, which is a country I know well, the vaccine distribution and manufacturing is allowed by one company, which happens to be owned by the king. And no doubt, once they get that up and running, they'll be sharing that with other countries. So it's kind of this interesting effect of diplomatic benefit from sharing, but also, reinforcing internal political dynamics in that story.
I fully agree. I think that in the European context, we have seen changes in the diplomatic relationships during the negotiations for the recovery plan and the other measures that have been adopted. And this is something that has been highly debated, because we could see interviews of our prime minister every day saying, this is what we are negotiating, this is what the Italian position is, and this is what we would like to achieve, which is not so common when we are talking about decisions adopted at the EU level. But it's, diplomatic and strategic use of vaccines makes it even more clear. I think we discussed this also during the last webinar, the role of countries that can produce and then sell to the others, selecting the other countries to which they sell their vaccine.
Yeah, before I ask the next question, I just wanted to say that I think it's interesting the way that this issue of emergencies has worked in the context of private actors. In South Africa, I know there are several decisions of the courts with the companies challenging government restrictions that cost them money. But at the global level, in relation to this question, we've seen the opposition, especially of the United States, to the waiver of the TRIPS agreement to suspend the TRIPS agreement for purposes of the patent on the various vaccines, to make them accessible much more widely. The current administration has promised to look into this. It hasn't yet said anything, but it's interesting that the way in which the role of sort of emergencies at that global level for purposes of sort of the private actors has, in my view, turned out quite differently than for civil liberties. But having said that, the next question is from Professor Trujillo. What would be a workable governing framework for future national emergencies as you define non-traditional, where there is a need for executive coherence and guidance, but operationalizing measures works best, is it locally or subnationally? Big question, but does the data help us think about another framework that's workable? And what would be some of the elements of that?
Maybe I'll just say a little bit. I'm sure Professor Ragone has thought about it too. I think, so first of all, I think to me, it goes back to this question of what do we think the kind of crises are going to be? So, and that's really what has to drive things. Our traditional paradigm, as I said before, is like a war, or a natural disaster. And those, in a war, you've got an enemy and you need a single coherent response that you better do quickly and coherently. And you don't really want to distribute, the information about that, widely. And so, that kind of calls for concentrated, perhaps executive response. With a natural disaster, you're sort of playing a game, if you will, against nature. And maybe in that case, the information is more decentralized or localized. And so you would want maybe a little bit more of a tailored response, not necessarily a unified one for the whole country, but just, drawing on the subnational governments and such. But then you have a pandemic, and it's really quite a different category if you think about it. It's kind of like you're playing a game against nature, that's the virus, but then the effectiveness of any response also means you have to sort of play a game with your own population, because you have to get them to follow the measures, and that's been extraordinarily difficult. People are just, the trust in government was so low to begin with in many countries that it's just made things really bad and made things worse. You also have these massive problems of inequality, which came up, race and poverty, and the existing inequalities getting exacerbated. So it's really hard. Certainly a unified, response seems to me to be not right when information is distributed, when you need people to buy into the response, right, in order to be effective. So that suggests that we should probably jettison some of the classical thinking about this and try to come up with, and really when we really start thinking about the big emergency, which is climate change, the ultimate slow moving one, you know, we really need to be thinking about, in my view, participation in government, you know, sort of constantly, mechanisms of building up trust again, mechanisms of dealing with inequalities, you know, across the government system. So I guess I'd almost say a workable governing framework for future national emergencies requires changing our government framework generally to be more workable.
Can I add something? Okay, so I think that the solution actually depends on the political culture and also on the paradigm of coordination in ordinary times, as Tom mentioned. I think we are now experimenting new forms of cooperation and collaboration between different layers, at least at the domestic level. For example, new joint meetings or new conferences, ways in which regions or states in federal states are entering into a dialogue with the central state. We probably need more cooperation in the decision, because if at the end of the day it's the central government that is going to decide, this is not through cooperation. But we are witnessing some experiments. For example, in Spain, for many years, the Conference of Presidents of Autonomous Communities did not serve its purpose, while now they're meeting like every few weeks during and thanks to the pandemic emergency, because the government needs the information that comes from territories, and they have to be involved then in the implementation. So I think that we're experimenting new instruments. Probably they will be included in political debates and potentially into constitutional or legal reforms in the next years.
Great. You know, we're almost out of time, but just wanted to add, I think that in addition to the discussion about the interventions at the domestic level, I think both of you have suggested that the interventions must be beyond the national and the subnational, because the kinds of crises like climate change we're discussing are not going to be resolved at the national or subnational level alone. And so, you know, in the prior hurricane seasons, in the context of sovereign debt, we saw hurricane clauses for sovereign debt. In the current context, we've seen clauses on sort of suspending payments as a way of dealing with the fact that some of these countries would not be able to deal with the payments because of the pressure of the pandemic, so that they got some liquidity relief. So I do think that we can't disconnect the international from the national and the subnational. But this has been a great discussion, and I thank both of you very much. And I now turn this to Professor Trujillo.
Well, thank you all so much for this fantastic discussion. I wish we had more time. It was really fascinating. And I want to thank all the participants for being here, for your questions, for being here for all of the webinars. Like I said, we've had more than 157 registrants for this series, and we hope to have more work and research in related areas to COVID pandemic, and hopefully a publication resulting from this webinar series. So please stay tuned, more to come. For more information on GLAPA and our work with the initiative at the University of Houston, please go to the GLAPA website, glapa.uofh.org. Thank you all so much. It's been a lot of fun. Stay safe, be well, and I hope that we may all meet in person very, very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Tom.